Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. You're hearing this probably on June 2nd, 2019, but I'm taping it on May 29th, 2019, the 24th day of Yar, 5779. I am with Yisrael Medad at the Begin Center in the heart of Jerusalem. We will get to that in just a minute. Just wanted to get some other items out of the way first. First of all, next week, Shavuot, next Shabbat and the whole weekend, there's still some places left to join me and the rest of the team at the Land of Israel Network, or most of the rest of the team at the Land of Israel Network, at the Mount Zion Hotel in Jerusalem. Lots of great programming, lots of Torah learning all night, going to the Kotel. I'll be giving a walking tour just outside the Begin Center, actually, of what's called Ketef Chinom in the afternoon, and also be guiding Herodian on Monday morning, June 10th, after the holiday is over. So if you haven't yet signed up and you're planning on being Jerusalem, you can just come for the meals and for the learning, even if you're not staying at the hotel, even if you're staying somewhere else. We would love what they're calling a la carte. So we would love to see you and have you join us for what is really a fantastic holiday, and what could be better than spending it in Jerusalem. Also, you can always go on my website, eveharrow.com, see what I'm up to. Planning now trip to North America in the beginning of September, and another one looks like mid to the end of November. So if you think that you'd like to have me in your community, I would love to come. So be in touch, and we'll see what we can work out. And of course, thank you to Ben and to Tabitha for doing this whole business of getting this show out on the airwaves, or whatever they call the internet these days. In any event, here I am with Yisrael Medad, also known as Winky, who just came back from a very interesting trip to a place that was a lot cooler than Jerusalem is today. I think it's 36 degrees centigrade. And he's managed to stay awake for this interview since he landed in the middle of the night. So, Winky, thanks so much for agreeing to join me here on the Land of Israel Network.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So, for those who don't know, the Begin Center is, about Menachem Begin, the former prime minister. But more than that, the trip that you're going on right now is, I think, more the roots of Menachem Begin's ideology, and where that came from, specifically Zev Jabotinsky and the Revisionists. A lot of people, even people who might be, let's say, know of or be supporters of today's Likud, which is the party that Menachem Begin, of course, was prime minister from, don't really understand the origins of that ideology, and that the beginning years of the state of Israel were really, there was a lot going on here, and things could have gone in different directions, not necessarily the socialist labor, as we call Labor Party direction, that it ended up going in. So maybe a little bit of background on what is revisionism, and then we'll talk about why you went to the places that you went.
Well, first of all, we were in the Ukraine. We were in Kiev and Odessa mainly. We made a short stop in Uman to say hello to Rabbi Nachman. But the purpose of it, as you correctly said, was to go to the sources, the base, and to explain that Zionism before Herzl was based in Russia, in that area of St. Petersburg, Moscow, going down to the Ukraine, and Odessa was where the Eretz Yisrael Committee, the Palestine Committee, began to operate before Herzl was the Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion. And all this type of pre-Herzlian type of Zionism was socialist, was political, was diplomatic, and it reflected eventually what was to be. Jabotinsky came in, he flirted a bit with socialism, and then left it off because he saw there was a competition between socialism and Zionism. And then we get into the period of going to the Jewish Legion and then going to working with Chaim Weizmann until the beginning of the mandate.
Well, so give us some years here, what you're talking about.
Well, the beginnings of Chovevei Zion in the 1880s, just after the big wave of pogroms in Russia, in which Jews began to realize that it's going to be quite different living in the Russian Empire than it was before.
You're talking about like Kishinev and some of these, which at the time when we see them through the lens of the Holocaust, seems like, oh, okay, a few hundred people, but it was really somewhat of a tipping point, right? And there'd been pogroms all through the centuries in Europe, and you have the Cossacks, and you have all these things. So what was it, though, then, in the 1880s about these pogroms that awakened, what else was going on that perhaps awakened something in the Jews there that hadn't yet been more fanned into flames over the preceding centuries?
Well, one thing I can say is that at that time, 1870s, young Jewish students were moving into the general revolutionary activity of going to the peasants. In other words, this movement of we can live in the diaspora, we just have to move into the more general stream and general population, and all of a sudden, bam, they're still Jews. They're not part of the Russian Empire. They're not part of the Russian population in a general sense. And a little bit later, I'm jumping forward, but the same issue, when Kishinev happens, Bialik, the famous national poet, writes a poem on the city of slaughter, which Jabotinsky translates into Russian. So I think, my opinion only, Eve, for the first time in centuries, out of simple religious dirges or keynote, as they say, that were written by rabbis, all of a sudden you have a secular literary testimony and a cry for help and a cry of upcoming disaster begins to go through the entire Russian Jewish population. You don't have to read Torah. You don't have to be intelligent in medieval Jewish poetry. And here comes Bialik, and Jabotinsky writes an introduction to it, which Bialik says is probably better than the poem I wrote.
Yeah, and he writes in Hebrew. He said he translated it into Russian. So what's the original language that Bialik is writing in?
Bialik is in Hebrew, of course. It just so happens that Bialik and a fellow by the name of Ravnitsky wrote a very famous book of a collection of the Agadot, the non-legal aspects of the Talmud, all the stories, whales and angels and all with our forefathers and stuff like that. And Ravnitsky was Jabotinsky's teacher. So while Jabotinsky was not particularly very religious at all, he had a very good grounding in Hebrew, which came back to him when in 1903 he became a Zionist. In that sense, he ran for the Duma, the Russian Congress in pre-revolutionary Russia, and he became very famous as a lecturer all across Russia. So we were going back to the country from which he sprung, from which he did battle with the Bund, and which he also wrote a novel called The Five, and was part of the secular Russian general population going to the opera, going to lecture in the all sorts of, and publish in the local press on non-Jewish topics altogether.
Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating to me that there is the Hebrew, because a lot of people think that it was Ben Yehuda, it was Eliezer Ben Yehuda who kickstarts Hebrew again, which he does in the sense of it being a spoken everyday language. But there are a lot of intellectuals over the years, like you said, Bialik, for example, the poet, who are writing in the literary world, and of course, obviously in the religious world, those who say the prayers, and of course who read the Torah. There is Hebrew, and they are writing in Hebrew. So, because I find it incredibly important, the idea that we speak Hebrew here in Israel. It's not taken for granted. So here it's making a transition. So what you're saying here is that because he writes it in Hebrew and it gets out there as not necessarily a religious tome, or as you said, like on the 9th of Av, where we have all these lamentations and we cry about, and things were added over the years, of course, because of the Inquisition and because of the Crusades and terrible things that happened to the Jews. But here you have a so-called modern event that comes out in Hebrew, that makes its way into the population, and that triggers something, some kind of, let's define Zionism. Is this nationalistic fervor among the Jews?
Two things. One, let's not forget that there was a Haskalah movement, what we call in English Enlightenment movement, among the Jewish population of Russia and Central Europe at that time. it's difficult to explain, but Galicia, which is the area in the west of Ukraine and the east of Poland, was on the lines of transportation railways. So in other words, and you'll pardon me for saying this, of course, women in Galicia would like to see what women in Paris were wearing, and things begin to seep in. And the whole thing of a literary world that a people define themselves not only by religion, not only by history, but their literature. Are they writing poems, short stories, plays, operas? Are they writing music with librettos in the languages? Began to seep into the Jews. So Hebrew became a avenue of redefining oneself, equal to France, England, Italy, and other places where there's, for those who know, there's also cultural revolution going on, Germany and stuff like that. So that was one side. The second side, which is more deeply connected to Jabotinsky, more than anything else, Jabotinsky defined a Jew as someone who had a Hebrew culture. If you couldn't speak Hebrew, you couldn't read Hebrew, you couldn't write Hebrew and understand, and not only Torah, as we said, but everything that's gone on, Spanish Jewry poetry, some of it Italian Jewry, some of it risque, like that, you weren't Jewish. Jewish was being someone sunk in Hebrew culture. So for him, language was foremost. And this is an off remark. When he relates to the Arabs or other minorities in the future Jewish state, he says they get full autonomy in a cultural sense. I understand their need for language, for their own schools and like that. That I'm willing to give them. Nothing, not too much more. But every people should be able to develop and feel their own language and their own culture expressed through the language.
So most people, if they're talking about a common language that the Jews had in Europe, they would, and you ask them, they'd say Yiddish. So how does Yiddish fit in here? Does it fit in here at all?
Well, Yiddish, in a certain sense, is unique because it uses the Hebrew letters. Okay? It's completely mispronouncing almost every Hebrew word that you and I know, and especially in the Sephardic pronunciation, inflection. But at least Yiddish relay the alphabet, but also on all sorts of cultural Jewish historical events. There's a lot of Yiddish which is slang, right? Which, let's give one example, balagola, right? Which in Hebrew is Baal Ha'agala, someone who's a wagon master. But then it becomes a term of someone who's not that smart. You know, someone who's very...
like a peddler or somebody coming around the way.
So this was living language, okay? What happened was, of course, that one of the things that we discovered in the sense of our trip, in the sense that Jabotinsky is fighting the Bund, who sanctified Yiddish as the diaspora language, and we can have our own existence here in the diaspora by having our own language. And Jabotinsky, you know, the language of the Jews is Hebrew, which means we have to go back to the land of Israel, not stay here and use Yiddish as a competitor, as a substitute for the true Hebrew heritage and treasures of what our people are.
And I would say this is a discussion that's not yet over, even in 2019. But give us a little bit of a background of Jabotinsky. Does he grow up in a rabbinic family? Where is he born? Like what shapes who he becomes? Well,
he grew into what we call today middle-income family. Unfortunately, the father, who was dealt in wood, if I'm not mistaken, some sort of commerce, died early. So he was an orphan, and I think he took it very bad. But his mother was from a Hasidic family, and she was very, very well oriented in terms of both religion, Hebrew, and the future, a future state of Israel.
And where was this?
He was born in Odessa. Odessa is the city of sin in Russia. It was a free port, basically founded in 1798, if I'm not mistaken. Catherine decided, we're taking over Odessa, and from a small little village on the edge of, and not really a port that much, a port was a little further southwest, they developed it as a free trade port. You have Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Arabs, Jews. Now, what happens, though, and I'll try to make this very short, when the Jews begin to come down from the north of Russia, from Moscow and further north in St. Petersburg, they lose all their communal organization. No rabbis, very few mikvahs, schools. Everything becomes sort of very free, and by less than a generation and a half, you're not that Jewish anymore in any sort of traditional religious sense from the shtetl, from the small village. So for Jabotinsky growing up, he went to regular school. He was well versed in Latin and Greek and opera and plays and something like that. And thank God we had anti-Semitism, and it snapped the Jews here and there out of their thinking that they could be absorbed in the general population with a little bit of a difference. I'm Jewish, so what does that mean? It means I take off Saturday, you take off Sunday. Nothing more than that, or something of that nature. Odessa was a port. He grew up there, but he left. He didn't graduate high school. At the age of 17, he couldn't take it anymore. He knew everything. He went out to Bern. Bern was too cold for him. So he went to Italy for 3 years, became a university student, came back to Russia in 1902, and then began slowly but surely and quickly after Kishinev, which you already mentioned, becoming one of the 10 major Zionist figures in Russia at that time.
Now, 1902, so did he know Herzl? Herzl starts with the World Jewish Congress already at the end of the 19th century, starts running around trying to get everybody that he could possibly speak to try and help create some kind of Jewish state in the Holy Land. Did they know each other?
They did not know each other. In fact, there's a very funny, he participated in only one Congress, Jabotinsky, where Herzl was. 1903. Herzl died the next year. And I won't get into all the details. So Jabotinsky was making a speech which was causing a lot of noise. So Herzl walks in and says, "Your time is up, young man." Mm-hmm. So that was the full extent of their relationship. But Jabotinsky was enamored of Herzl. A presentable, lovely-looking gentleman with the beard, with the uprightness, with the tuxedo, the evening gown and stuff like that. And so he remained, eventually when he split off from the World Zionist Organization, became an opponent of Weizmann and Ben-Gurion. For him, it was going back to Herzlian Zionism of politics, of diplomacy, of going to kings, princes, church people, and everybody else, of working with governments, not so much the people. And that was one of the things that separated him from many of the other Zionists at that time.
So you said he at some point broke with Ben-Gurion and broke with Weizmann. It's a very big break. I don't think people realize it's not just a left-right or whatever we would call that today ideology, but it has to do with economics. It has to do with how to deal with the Arabs that are here. So can you give us a little summation of how Jabotinsky differs from Ben-Gurion? Differs, putting it mildly. I mean, the two are really, at some point, quite bitter enemies.
They were enemies. Ben-Gurion wouldn't allow his body, which had been buried, Jabotinsky's body, which was buried in New York, to be reinterred into Israel. It was only Levi Eshkol, who took over from Ben-Gurion in 1964, that there was a reburial of Jabotinsky. That's how bad things got. He said, "We don't need dead Jews here. We need live Jews." Anyhow, the point, I'm going to try to make it simple. Weizmann worked, and Jabotinsky worked, and Ben-Gurion even worked for the Jewish Legion. Okay? They were all together in that. What happens is the mandate that comes afterwards and the anti-Zionist British administration in the early 2 to 3 years, Jabotinsky very quickly realizes if this is the way we're starting, we're not going to get anywhere fast.
So you're talking about World War I.
Going World War I and immediately afterwards, okay?
Okay, so just a word about what the Jewish Legion is.
The Jewish Legion was a force of eventually 5,000 Jews who lived abroad and in Israel, mainly in England, America, Canada, Argentina, and shall we call them Palestinian Jews, who mobilized into the British Army to fight on the land of Israel front. A fellow by the name of Trumpeldor, Joseph Trumpeldor, who may be known to somebody, the one-armed hero, he was in an earlier unit called the Zion Mule Corps, which Jabotinsky didn't like because it was a transportation unit, a carrying ammunition, fuel, and food up to the front. He says, this is not for me. Trumbull says, look, I've been in the army. Anything's good for the army. Jabotinsky says, no, I want something that's fighting, because once the British see that Jews are willing to shed blood on Eretz Yisrael, they will give it to us. So it was part of the Balfour Declaration. That's a short. But what happened, now I'm getting to the main point, is that the British conquer Eretz Yisrael in December 1917. Until the mandate is 1922. In between, the British have a military administration, and in the first a year and a half of civil administration before the mandate, under Herbert Samuel. Jabotinsky is very, very upset at the direction. He writes letters to Weizmann. Nothing is working. He wants to take a firm stance. He wants to go back to London, get all the parliamentarians who supported us, throw these guys out. And Weizmann says, listen, we can move. We can do this. Let's not upset the apple cart too early. And that's where the split begins. That leads to as you mentioned before, a very deep divide between the general Zionists of Weizmann and the socialist Zionism of Ben Gurion, and the revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky.
So Jabotinsky doesn't want there to be a mandate. He wants, post-World War I, that the Jews immediately get a state. What exactly does he want to do when he's going to London and talking to the parliamentarians? It's different than what Weizmann and Ben Gurion are doing.
It's not that he was against the mandate. He was against the fact that the people that we had as friends and allies to issue the Balfour Declaration, to go to the San Remo Conference of April 1920, and then to go to, eventually, to the League of Nations in Geneva in 22 and get us the mandate, we want those politicians to throw out all the local people. Because, why? Because of the Arabs. The Arabs rioted in 1920 and in 1921 in Jerusalem and 1921 in Jaffa. So the local British administration is already beginning to compromise on Zionism. It's already no Hebrew as an official language, going back to what I said before. No stamps with Hebrew on it. Okay? All these things Jabotinsky saw were on the left foot. And if we don't change it now, forcefully, telling the politicians to tell the local administrations, things are going to be bad. And basically, he was correct, because that's how everything began to go bad. 1929 came, and then later it was like that. And
1929, a lot of pogroms all over Israel. Hebron, the most people are killed there, but in Jerusalem and in Tzfat and all over the land. And so why doesn't he win? But in this battle that he has in terms of the direction things would go, and how come his case doesn't supersede Weizmann and Ben Gurion? Because that's a critical time period. Like, I look back and I think things could have been very different, for good and for bad, and the things happened the way they happened, right? And you had socialism, which really is how we began our state in a very socialist way, as opposed to some of the free economy that he would have preferred seeing. What do you think were like the key elements here? Was it the overwhelming personalities of Weizmann and Ben Gurion, or certain friendships that they had? But why? And then Jabotinsky really never recovers from that. I mean, and the revisionists are out for a long, long time, you could say, theoretically, until 1977, when Menachem Begin becomes prime minister. That's a long time out in the wilderness. You're talking over half a century. What happened here, in your opinion? I know there's no definite answer, but what do you think in those critical years post-World War I? Again, we still got the League of Nations. We don't have the UN. What was going on?
Two things I have to stress here. One is for all of us, discussing everything that happened 100 years ago and 50 years ago. We're now the generation of post-statehood. We have, you and I, Eve, have no idea, not even talking about our audience, have no idea how Jews thought without knowing there was a state of Israel existing. The IDF, the parliament, these things didn't exist. And for Jews not to have that, they were weak in spirit. And every once in a while, if there was pressure, if there were difficulties, obstacles, they would lean back on their previous behavioral patterns, which were go easy, don't push, let's not get excited, don't be extreme. Let's not make demands. Let's make suggestions, and all sorts of things like that. So that is one of the reasons why Jabotinsky was different and rejected eventually, because he was, as one of his Russian friends said, you have a Goyish cup. You have a non-Jewish head on you. You don't act like the other Jews. Okay? So that's number one. The second thing, of course, is we're talking about our reflection now in Russia and the trip and the Bund and socialism, as you stressed. A lot of Jews were similar to something that's going on now as we see the past 10 years, liberal. And today they're liberal, humanist, progressives. Then they were socialists. Socialism was not bad 100 years ago or 80 years ago as we think of it as today. It was just another way of getting society better. And it didn't work, of course, because it led to Bolshevism. But so a lot of the people who were coming over from Russia and Poland came from the left wing. The people who were coming from the right wing at first did not come in great numbers. And then Jabotinsky in the Zionist congresses couldn't get enough power. They began to shut off the gates of the land of Israel to anybody who was in Beitar, anybody who was in his revisionist movement, and he lost the numbers. Numerically...
Who shut the gates?
The Jewish Agency. When the British would give you a 1,500 certificates for immigration, so, 50% would go to Mapai, which was in the main Socialist Party, 20% would go to the General Zionists of Chaim Weizmann. I'm just sort of giving an idea. Another 10% would go to religious. Another 3.5% would go to Jabotinsky's movement. So it was like a catch-22 certain situation in that sense.
So right from the very beginning, Ben-Gurion, who's not a bad politician at all, is making sure that anybody who's going to be his political rival or part of the rival camp is simply not showing up in Israel. He's like hand-picking to some degree the kind of state that he feels he wants to build, he and Weizmann, and getting the people here from Europe who are going to go with what he wants to do.
I think the word is pronounced hegemony, okay? If you came to the land of Israel during the mandate and you weren't a member of the Histadrut, you were out of work. If you didn't read the Davar newspaper, you didn't carry it to work, everybody looked at you strangely. If you didn't go to the Hapol football, soccer games, you were out. But this is for another discussion in the sense of how the left-wing, left-of-center Zionists managed to take control of an organization, mainly because, going back now to Jabotinsky, Weizmann was weak in the sense of negotiating with the British and weak in negotiating with Ben-Gurion. Jabotinsky was too rough, was too forward, was too being extreme, and therefore they didn't like him, and they didn't like his Zionism. In the end, we know that the 39 came. We didn't have a state in the sense of he maybe would have pushed a lot harder against the British in order to get it.
And because we didn't have a state in 39 and the British were still in control here, they can issue the white paper, which pretty much shuts down immigration from Europe. And 6 million dead Jews later, and a decade, close to a decade, we're finally able to declare a Jewish state. So these are critical years and critical decisions that were made. And the fact that Jabotinsky was not as powerful as he should have been had huge ramifications. This wasn't just like a different political idea that he had. The fact that he could have pushed and didn't push was very, very big for our people. So what happens then? So he's not here. His ideology is not the one that's really running. So where does he go from there?
He goes to Poland, for example, and the Polish Beitar, the youth Zionist, his Zionist youth movement, was about 60,000 people, youngsters. And
Beitar from the Bar Kokhba,
from the Bar
Gavalt. Okay, so it's
also an acronym for the Covenant of the Youth of Joseph Trumpeldor. Yeah.
So he gets a big youth movement going. We've also, just to throw in a little bit of history here with Bar Kokhba, so that's something that's, of course, the 2nd century rebellion against Hadrian the Emperor, which doesn't go well, although we do have a free state of Judea for between 132 and 135. But that's seen as kind of, I guess, like the last time the Jews were really fighting, and so that becomes somewhat of a connected and like you also have teams that are named the Maccabees, that kind of idea, kind of connecting back to a time where Jews were still fighting, which is something now that we don't even really consider because we've got all these soldiers and this amazing army. But as you said before, we really don't understand the mindset of the Jews of 100 years ago who were coming out of as weak people and coming out of just keep your heads down and don't make any trouble, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. So what does he do then in these years, of the mandate period?
Well, to go back to his Russian period, which was the purpose of the trip, he was very much at home among the non-Jews. So he goes to Poland, for example, and goes right up to the top, the foreign minister, the president, and says, listen, you guys, you don't want Jews here? Okay, I don't want the Jews here either. So you know what? Why don't you help me take Palestine away from the British? So I'm making a very long story short. For example, in 1939, 25 members of the Irgun, the underground Jewish resistance group, pre-1939, there was another group under Begin, I'm talking about even a pre-one like that, find themselves in a place called Andrychova in South Poland, getting trained by the Polish army. So he was able, I think he was daring, and I think he knew how to talk to the non-Jew and act as a Jew, which the non-Jew would appreciate and could be at home with or talk equally. And he was very successful in that. Unfortunately, as you mentioned before, time ran out. If he had another 5, the British closed the gates. He established clandestine immigration into Israel with the boats. Before Ben Gurion and the Haganah and the Mossad La'aliyah did this in the 1940s. So he simply...
was he involved with trying to cut a deal with the Germans at some point to get the Jews here?
No, he had a boycott on Germany from 1933 on. He refused to meet with Mussolini, even though he knew Italy very well. I was a student there, as I mentioned earlier. Chaim Weizmann met with Mussolini 4 times, right? But Jabotinsky was the fascist, whereas Chaim Weizmann was our moderate Jew. But okay, that's the way history goes. So I think one of the things I picked from the trip that we started with was the fact we began to see where Jabotinsky grew up. What was his shaping elements that led him be the Zionist that we've been discussing now, in a certain sense. Did you know that he had his own seat in the opera in Odessa with a name on it called Jabotinsky?
Really? You went there? You saw that?
Well, we didn't see that. We couldn't go inside, but we went to the opera house. We went to the Department of Literary Sciences of the University of Odessa, and we sat in the same room that he lectured in 1902, 1903. And we saw his neighborhood, and we saw the Potemkin Steps, and we saw all sorts of things, trying to, for us anyway, as employees at the Begin Center, and of course Begin's, as you said before, at the beginning of the interview, the root of where Begin got his ideology was Jabotinsky. It's great to see where a man lived and grew up, and the trees and the benches and the streets and the cafes that he sat in, and the editorial offices of a newspaper which he wrote articles for, and to just see where people that we think were great when they started out at the age of 20, 21, 22, first getting into political and public life.
Mm-hmm. So from Odessa, you went to where?
No, Odessa was the last stop. We were in Kiev earlier. Why were we in Kiev? Well, as you mentioned, this was a tour of the employees of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. It may be odd, but in Kiev, it seems to be the best, what's the word I'm looking for, leftovers of the archives of the KGB and the GPU and the Cheka, going all the way back to the Tsar. Most of them, when the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union Empire, began to break down, all the files were either destroyed or put away or whatever it was. In Kiev, we have enough, and they have a lot of files on the beginning of the Zionist movement in the 1880s, 1900s, up into World War I, and just a little bit afterwards. So we've been, for several years now, going back and forth, looking for documents about Begin, about Jabotinsky, about the revisionists, and also things like that. And so we got a lecture from the chief archivist and his deputy in a Chabad shul in Kiev on the Shabbat on elements of history of Jabotinsky, revisionist movement, and Zionism early on in the 20th century in Russia.
Do you have any, everything's declassified, or at least a good part of it? Is there any still issue here with some secrecy? And really leading that in, because I'm sure that a lot of my listeners confuses them as it confuses me. Exactly what is the situation here vis-a-vis, it's not the Soviet Union anymore, but Russia, which is still not what you call a Jeffersonian democracy, and Kiev and the Ukraine. Just so happens that my husband and I are now watching the Netflix series Chernobyl, which, and even though I knew how bad it was, like, it's a fascinating series. If you haven't seen it, everybody, try and get a hold of it. And how there are a lot of people who feel that that's really a good part of what led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that whole disaster, which could have even been so much worse, and how it was mishandled and how the scope of it just shocked so many people that at some point eventually, as we know, at the end of the 80s, the Soviet Union comes apart. But do you still, like, did you have trouble traveling anywhere? Is it a totally free country? You feel like you're behind some kind of iron curtain? What was it like there? And maybe a little bit of the current politics in that area.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Ukraine is its own country now. It's separated from the Soviet Union, or whatever you want to call it. It's not under Putin's boot anymore. And they have their own life. In fact, we spent a good couple of minutes in Maidan Square, where a couple of years ago, over 127 people were shot and killed demonstrating for freedom. I think it was unique for me because we, all the religious guys, a few of us, I wore kippah on the Shabbat. I didn't wear a hat. And we were walking through down center of Kiev. No one said anything at all. No one bothered us. And
it's good you weren't in Germany.
But they're very patriotic, and they have their own flag and their own colors and stuff like that. They have their own language. Ukrainian is not exactly Russian.
And their own prime minister who's Jewish, yes.
And their president who's Jewish. Both of them. We have president and prime minister who are Jewish. So we felt no. Once or twice you heard some remark, but no different than New York. But so we had a nice time in Kiev in the sense of our guide, someone who works at the Menachem Begin Center, was born in Kiev, grew up in Kiev. He was head of Beitar in Ukraine. So it was also sharing his going back and looking at all the situation. And the cooperation between official Kiev academic institutions and a Menachem Begin Heritage Center is very good for us. And going to Chabad was also okay.
Mm-hmm. Is there trade? Do you know? Did you get at that little aspect between Israel and the Ukraine, like in terms of those relations? Do you know anything about that?
All sorts of agricultural produce, and a lot of Israeli products are on general shelves of there. From Odessa, it was 2 hours and 25-minute flight. To Kiev, it was 3.5 hour flight or something like that. So, and a secret, not a secret, there are a lot of Ukrainian Jews who are Israelis. They've come here, made Aliyah, whatever reason, they're back there. So it's an ongoing thing. On our flight, we saw a lot of Israelis, kosher supervisors, businessmen. There's a Mendy's restaurant in downtown Odessa. There's another restaurant in Kiev. So there are a lot of things developing between Israel and Ukraine in the sense of a strong Jewish and a non-Jewish commercial, economic type of relationship, which is one of the things that we observed there.
Right. So now, they were once a real breadbasket, right? And Stalin does a big hit there, obviously, post-World War II. Are they still suffering from that?
I don't think no. I don't think they're suffering from that from the mid 1930s when basically Stalin starved them to death. But as you said, Eve, breadbasket, we drove by bus from Kiev all the way down to Odessa, and is miles and miles and hours of flat green land that you can imagine. Is very agricultural, very producing. I don't know what they're doing there myself personally, but in terms of anybody who's gone on an Eve Harrow tour knows that Israel has a lot of rocks, a lot of hills, and a lot of valleys and up and downs like that. There, it's straight for literally hundreds of kilometers. And you could see that it's a great agricultural thing. I'm not so hot about their apples, to tell you the truth. And it's much more fish than meat still. But maybe that's the Jewish cooking that's going on there. But I loved going through it, just simply going through it. And I have high hopes that it will be restored to some of its previous level and stature as an independent country. What the Jews are doing there, look, I can, at my age, Jews want to make money, Jews want to invest, want to go into commerce and trades like that, and you have to go back and forth. That's one thing. Hopefully there'll be less Jews there in a few years than more, and for all the good reasons, not any of the bad reasons.
Right. But you're saying you didn't feel any really anti-Semitism.
No, not only no anti-Semitism, but the conflict with Russia and the so-called Russian rebels was far to the east, so we weren't under any sort of security threat. Even though 2 days after we left, according to the Jerusalem Post, threatening email of a bomb being planted in the synagogue that we prayed in on Saturday on the Shabbat.
What happens there during World War II?
World War II, and that was the first thing we went to, Eve, was Babi Yar. I knew about Babi Yar, of course, and I hope many of people who are listening to your program have read Ivashchenko's, if I'm mispronouncing it, his very famous poem about there are no memorials at Babi Yar. I knew it was a ravine, okay, but I wasn't quite exactly sure what it looked like. You enter this area in the old Jewish section of Kiev called Polny. There's no Jewish till today, okay? There's no Jewish star. There's no specific. It says Jews were killed, but among about everybody else, the Russian prisoners, you local. And then you walk into this park. At the far end, about 150 yards on, there's a menorah that was only put up a couple of years ago in the dead of winter. And then you walk another 50 feet, and there's a drop, maybe 20, 25 meters down, which originally was 50 meters down. Babi Yar was supposed to be developed as a ski resort for competition. And 35,000 Jews of Kiev in 2 days were taken there, stripped of their clothing, stripped of their personal effects, and shot and pushed down. So if the bullet didn't get you, the 50-meter fall got you. But even one more thing, at the end of the 2 days when they filled up the ravine, it was only 27 meters deep. That's how many Jews were piled one on another.
So who did this and when?
This was the Germans. They, in less than a week, I think it was about a week, they had conquered. For those who can't remember, in June of 1941, Hitler breaks up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of non-aggression and invades Russia all along the line from Vilna all the way down to Odessa. And Kiev falls. And I won't go into details, but within a week, all the Jews, 35,000 of the Jews left, if I'm not mistaken. 100,000 fled. 100,000 fled to the east, all these Muslim republics deep in Russia. But those who remained, with 2 days, they were taken out. And sometimes the German Nazis would line up 2 or 3 people, so they'd use only one bullet. Okay, because in any way, they were going to push them down into the ravine and cover them over. That's the memorial that we went to. Very, very depressing. It's a lovely little forest. But then you walk to the edge, and anybody who has fear of heights begin to say, wait a second, you mean Jews stood here naked in September on Yom Kippur and were shot and thrown and tossed in and then covered up. One girl crawled out alive. And then she testified in a Russian post-war trial of the Nazis that were caught.
Which is really when people find out about it, right? This was not known, the massacre at Babi Yar. It wasn't known for a long time, was it?
It wasn't known for a very long time. And it was only because of Ivegny, I can't pronounce Russian names very well. I apologize to our listening audience. And not beat up to the standards of Eve Harrow's normal guests. It was only 1961 that this really broke through. It was all quiet. There was, though, we were told, one event, I think in the 60s that broke. There was a huge flood, huge rain, and everything began to wash down from the ravine. And people were saying the Jews are having their revenge on Kiev. When a lot of things flowed out, stuff like that. And it became part of the Soviet Jewish struggle. Anybody knows my personal history from 1964 being involved, Babi Yar became sort of a symbol of freeing Russian Jews that under Russian, they not only couldn't eat matzot, not only they couldn't celebrate Shabbat or be Jew or get to Eretz Yisrael, they couldn't even remember who they were when they were killed by the Nazis in 1941.
So thank you for bringing that up, your involvement with Soviet Jewry. For you as somebody who was really like very, very involved and going in and bringing things to the Jews and all those years, did that have
being followed around by KGB agents? One of my life experiences.
So did that add a certain element for you on this trip over and above? You were educational director here at Menachem Begin Center for a long time. Incredibly steeped both in Jabotinsky, the revisionist ideology, Menachem Begin's life. Was there a little bit of like another feeling in there for you, kind of maybe closing a circle even, that you were there, that you're seeing, as you said, you wish it wasn't so rich and you wish they were more here, but there is a Chabad and you can wear a kippah freely. Is there something like a little bit of a nice feeling there that accompanied you on this trip?
I'm going to take a spin off of that. My Zionist education from Jabotinsky and Begin was that a Jew could be as normal a person as possible. He just happens to speak Hebrew. He has different religious rituals, but he's no different in a human point of view than anybody else. And he shouldn't be treated as someone you can knock his hat off or slugged in the streets of Brooklyn or whatever happened in California and Pittsburgh and other places. And as you obliquely referenced Germany and you can't wear a yarmulke and stuff like that. That was my Zionism, in the sense of, yes, we have our own cultural, religious aspects, historical aspects, but we're no different than anybody else. And in a certain sense, going back there now to see where the Russians had oppressed Jews, that there are Israeli products on the shelf, that you can walk through the street with only a kippah on your head. And the only thing I want to warn people going there, they don't know how to build steps. Either the first step or the last step is shorter than anything else. And one of the girls on the trip said, I pity the drunks here in Kiev. They're probably falling all over themselves trying to get up and down the steps. To see that Israel or something Jewish is normal, is part of the life, and no one gets upset. I'm not going to say no one. I'm sure every once in a while there's something wrong, but in the sense of, at least for us anyway, as visitors, no problem walking through the streets. In fact, we were at a place called Sophia Cathedral. It was, I think, originally built around 1020. It's been rebuilt. Beautiful little building. We couldn't go in because... Anyway, two street players in costume wanted to perform for us. So a guide said, look, this is not the group because it's, they can't give you any money. The guy says, oh, Shabbat? he says, "Oh, Shabbat," no, and he wasn't Jewish, so that he knows. That's the normality, which I think is one of the elements of what Zionism did for the Jews, to return them to a status that they're not less equal, if I can phrase it that way, to anybody else in the world, whether they're German, Russian, French, or American. That's one level that I think has been achieved, in relatively speaking, on our visit.
All right. As opposed to, let's say, other places in Europe where Zionism has now become the excuse for anti-Semitism, which is essentially what you're saying, that idea of just hating the Jews to hate the Jews.
I hope our next trip is not to France, okay? Let's put it that way. Someone said, next visit in another 3 years. We went 3 years ago. We went to Warsaw, Brisk in Belarus, and to Vilna, in the footsteps of Begin, who was there in prison and went to school in Warsaw, was born in Brisk. Now we did Jabotinsky. So one of the people said, okay, the next trip in another 3 years is Vienna and Basel in the footsteps of Herzl.
That should be a nice trip.
If I'm still around, then I'll try to get on that one also.
Some of the people that went with you, or even the Bnot Sherut, the girls who were doing national service here, and that wasn't just you guys who've been doing this for a long time. You think that had an effect on them, that going and seeing these places that they're learning about was really tremendously worth it?
First of all, I want to thank the Menachem Begin Heritage Center for giving national service girls the opportunity to do something like that, as you say, to see where history took place, to see the trees, the streets, the buildings, synagogues, then and now. I think it's a war. I don't believe in local patriotism to the extreme. There are lovely things to see all over the world. It's nice, as the Israeli songs, I've seen Paris, I've seen Rome, but it's nice to be home. True, it doesn't mean you have to cut yourself off. And I think Jabotinsky, in that sense, was an example of a person who could write poetry, newspaper articles, and do all sorts of things that weren't specifically Jewish, and he knew Latin, Greek, and all sorts of things like that. I think it's important for girls, especially growing up in Israel, especially, if I may say so, Eve, from the religious stream, not to be limited and cut off from everything there is that the world can offer. You're educated well, you don't go off the derech, as we say, you don't go off the path, but not to see something of beauty. Even in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of Fathers, it says, if you're passing by a beautiful tree, you make a blessing. The tree has nothing intrinsically Jewish in it, but it has beauty, it has shape, it has life of its own. You can be Jewish and Israeli and local patriot, but you can see all sorts of things like that. You yourself, I've been following your trips around the world, in Greece and other places, you do that. There's nothing wrong with it, and I think it was very nice that the girls, at least especially at this age, don't get really too much of a chance to get out and see things like that. It was very good for them to be on the trip.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was a huge thing for them to be able to do, and hopefully will stay with them really for the rest of their lives and to enrich them, because as much as Israel is home, there is a big, beautiful world out there, and I'll tell my listeners, that's also why I'm pre-taping the show, because on Sunday I'm going with one of my children to St. Petersburg, where I've been before, but just for a very brief time. Also, there was a very large Jewish community there for a long, long time. Like very many Ashkenazi Jews, I also have roots in, different parts of Russia, as many of us do. And I'm very curious to learn about that and see as well. It doesn't make me less confident in Israeli and as a Jew, quite the opposite. Because I am so at home here and because I'm so proud that we have our own country, you can let yourself go and learn about other things without being threatened, something that I think is perhaps sorely lacking in the world right now. A lot of people just want to be in some echo chamber, just hear what they want to hear and not say, I can learn something else. I don't have to agree with it. I can be glad I'm not there anymore. I'm glad I'm not here anymore. But it's fascinating to learn about people, about human nature, about human history.
One small snapshot before we finish. We came to the Bristol Hotel in Odessa. It's a 130-year-old building, exactly as it was. Built up, it's like that, but the shape like that. And we're waiting to get in, and me being me, I look around, and I see a fellow with a beard and a hat. Looks like a Chabad chassid. and I look behind them as one or two men with kippot on, and they're standing at the far end of outside the hotel at the end. Being me, I walk over and I say, hi. What is this? Oh, we're celebrating a bar mitzvah. Now, after all we discussed even Holocaust and Odessa and Kiev and stuff like that, to be able in a Russian Empire, modern Ukrainian Republic, to be able to see Jews standing on the sidewalk, yes, we're celebrating a bar mitzvah. Jewish life goes on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's renewed in the wrong direction or less than the correct, but the Jewish people are alive, and that's also one message I always try to take away from these trips, to see where history was, but where history is going. And it was very nice to be able to notice that on the trip.
Right. And as much as both you and I love this country and would like to see many Jews living here, Jews have to be able to practice Judaism safely wherever they choose to be. It shouldn't be that because of anti-Semitism, Jews remember that they're Jews, which is just so sad. But there are Jews who fall into that category. Only when we're persecuted do they realize that maybe there's something to this. But because we're just normal people like everybody else, and everybody of every religious stripe should be able to go wear what they want to wear, as long as they're not hurting anybody else, worship the way they want to worship. That's what a free world should be. And it's frightening that we even have to have this discussion, especially after what happened in World War II. But sadly, we do. And I'm glad that at least in the Ukraine, you didn't have those feelings and those fears that we might have in the more enlightened countries, if you will, of Western Europe, or even tragically in North America that we have today. So thank you for sharing about this trip. It's fascinating. And now I'm thinking to myself, maybe at some point I'll get there, but we'll have to see. If this conversation piqued someone's interest about Jabotinsky, about revisionism, about Menachem Begin, about this whole process that got us to where we are today. You know, we do have a prime minister, or maybe, I don't know what's going to be with this government and if we're going to new elections, who is the ruling party, is the Likud party, which is coming out of this particular ideology. Any sources, any books that you can recommend for people to read to learn more about this?
Well, there's one very good the most recent biography of Jabotinsky that's really good, 2 volumes, a bit heavy, but it's a really good read, is Lone Wolf by Samuel or Shmuel Katz. I think Hillel Halkin has a smaller book out on Jabotinsky. And if anybody today Googles Jabotinsky revisionism, revisionist Zionism, there's a lot of good works out there, because it's also connected to the Israeli undergrounds, the Irgun and the Stern Group, the Lehi, and stuff like that. And for anybody who really likes to recall that he doesn't know enough and he wants to know, or he or she wants to know more, I'd suggest they do that. Anything else, write to Eve at Land of Israel and say, this is for Yisrael Medad.
Okay, and I'll pass it on. My first exposure to Jabotinsky, believe it or not, was a novel that he wrote called Samson many, many, many years ago, before I was really, involved with a lot of things that I'm doing right now. And it was a great book. So there was that side of him as well, a writer of fiction. So people are multifaceted, and that's great to know. Okay, Yisrael Medad, Winky, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about the trip that you just took in the footsteps of Jabotinsky and of revisionism. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. You can always write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Love hearing from you. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye for now. Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, host of Rejuvenation. Join us on the Land of Israel Network for the Shavuot of a Lifetime, where I will be giving a special class that weekend and guiding Herodian on Monday as the bus goes out to the farm. So join us for the Shavuot of a Lifetime in just a few weeks. Thursday through Monday, June 6th through 10th, 2009.